Welcome, Steven. It's so great to have you here on the Human Side of Business podcast.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So everyone, I'd like to introduce you to Steven Gaffney of the Steven Gaffney Company. And he's coming out of Washington today to talk to us a lot about communication within your organization. So Steven, maybe you can kick us off a little bit about your experiences and the Steven Gaffney Company.
So basically what my company does, is it's all about creating consistently high achieving organizations. And the way we do that is through the team stuff that we do a lot with the top executive teams. And then if you unpack that even further, which kind of deals with what we're going to be talking today, is around honest communication. And really that's a critical element to making a team and overall organization go. And I can talk to you immediately about the whole honest communication, because it's not like what people think it is,
Break it down. Let's hear it. What's the definition?
Get right into it, right?
Let's get right in.
So when people hear me talk about honest communication, they think I'm going to go down the truth or lies, the ethical component. But really, that's not the problem. And I don't really think that's a big issue with people. When I talk about honest communication, I'm talking about a certain element of that. And that's about what people don't say to each other. In fact, if people forget everything out of what we're going to talk about, the most important message right up front is the biggest problem in life is not what people say, it's actually what they don't say to each other. It's, lies of withholding, although people don't like that. Oh, I'm not lying. Well, if you ever had somebody not say something to you and you feel like they lied to you, and It breaks down trust. So the key is to get that unsaid said.
And you had already explicitly identified your acronym, but you do it through this way called CHAT. So consistently high achieving team. And so can you walk us through at a high level, like what does that mean?
Excellent question. So what's mostly out there is all around high performing teams. Yes. But I think that's kind of old hat and not really where we really need to honor where people are right now and where they're going. So the word performing could be easily confused with hard work. It may not be what people intended, but it can be confused. And we are not paid to work hard. We're paid to produce results. And when you think about it, I'll often say to executives or key leaders, how often have you been frustrated by you've asked somebody to do something, or you're talking about a project that has gotten dropped off or something didn't work. They say, well, what do you want me to do? I'm working as hard as I can. Well, that's not the problem. It's about how we're working, what we're doing, and achieving. The other thing it's missing is about doing it consistently. So how do you consistently have high achieving teams? That's really what it's about. Achievement and doing it consistently, which is all really our specialty and what we do for these major companies.
And that's what really piqued my interest about your approach, Steven, is that consistency piece. Because being humans, we're not always consistent. So give us a little anecdotal story around this whole consistency piece.
Well, when you look at, first of all, when you think about it, many organizations, to your point, we can hit a high note, but it's about doing it consistently. So I've identified there's 12 essential elements of a consistently high achieving team. And one of the keys is come from anything as possible. So what will happen is you'll see it where somebody is successful and then they just stop, or they think that, okay, we've got it. But there's competitors or other outlying factors too that really influence it. So I always say, if we're not progressing, we are regressing. There's no such thing as a status quo. So a lot of these organizations that I do work with, it's about doing it consistently and achieving it. What's the next level? So whether I'm doing work with Amazon, Marriott, Lockheed Martin, or the US military, it's really about achieving to the next level. So I'll give you a specific example. I was working with the CIO of one of the top companies in the world. And his issue was, we are all achieving overall, but now what needs to happen to the next level is us working much more as a team. He said, I have individual star performers, and within their area, they're like silos of excellence. But we really need to be an overall team that's excellent. So they were producing results, but it's now about taking it to the next level. And why that's so important in the IT area is because things are always improving. If we always have to be improving, but that's true about just about any profession, right? So if we're not progressing, we're regressing, but that's a specific example and a little bit more out of what you have. I elaborated.
That's okay. No judgment here. That's for sure. So what got you on to the whole thought process of, when it comes to your definition of honest communication, it's really honing in and making sure that we're saying everything and we're not withholding intentionally or not information?
So what I discovered is that that is really the major source of problems. I mean, when you really think about it, whether it's even in our personal life or work life, really when you unpack it, it's why didn't they just tell me that? Why didn't my boss just tell me that? Why didn't my customer just say that? We lose a great customer and you find out the real reason. You think we could have done something. How about pricing structure? You thought, well, my gosh, if that's what they wanted with the budget, we could have worked within that. Right. So often in life. So I'll give you even on a personal example. I was doing a session for a company where a guy came up to me at a break. He said, I wish I had this session a while back. And he said, I said, why? And he said, my wife of 25 years has informed me she wants a divorce. And he had no clue that his wife was unhappy. Now, I did ask him, how did you miss the boat here, right? And he said, I work really hard and I just stopped doing the things that make a good marriage, listening and talking. And we just stopped communicating. And so what I'm struck by is almost any problem, and I would challenge anybody, just about any problem is sourced back to not getting the unsaid said. And and to prove my point, there's a book that was written years ago called The Human Element, and it was written by Dr. Will Schutz. And he discovered that 80% of workplace problems, 80%, so 8 out of every 10, is due to lack of honest communication, really getting the unsaid said.
Right.
And so it's a really big problem. And that's where I don't think most people focus on. So often it's like tone and attitude and all that great stuff. But really, it's just getting the unsaid said and then resolving it.
100%. And what's your, without divulging kind of like your trade secrets or proprietary information here, Steven, but what's your thought process or beliefs around helping people get comfortable? Because it's oftentimes what I've seen in past anyways, it's not that professionals are walking into the organization like, what can I unsay today or not say today, right? It's more so around comfort level, or maybe it's a communication style, behavioral style. Maybe there's some previous trauma in the workplace around having authentic conversations or I guess wholesome, full conversations. So like, what's your take on that?
So I like to take complex problems and make it simple. And so the number one reason why people withhold is fear. Fear of retribution, fear it's going to hurt somebody's feelings. How about this one? Fear it's going to go on the list and somebody's never going to let it go. Right? You can tell me anything. Well, now that you've told me that, I will never let you forget that, right? So it's really that fear that we all have. Now, it might be because of our previous job, our previous relationship, trauma, whatever the case may be, but it's all around fear. So now that unlocks what we need to do in all of our relationships. And what I think is the most important trait in a great leader, and that's creating emotional safety.
Yes.
And I'm saying emotional safety on purpose, not psychological safety.
Yes.
So most of the stuff out there is around psychological safety. And, I'm not afraid to say things that, some people are going to really get mad about this, but I think it's just flat out not correct. My experience is, and I've been at this for over 25 years, is people can think it's safe. They need to feel that it's safe.
100%.
That's why I drive home. It's about creating that emotional safety. And that is the most important trait in a leader, because if you create that emotional safety, people will share stuff and you don't have to make all the right decisions. Because if you make something, it goes in the wrong direction, people tell you. But if you make that fear with people, they'll shut down. So creating that emotional safety is the key.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. And it resonates because I can think of a couple examples, even in my own history, where, I think that it's safe to speak. And so I speak, and then it's like, I'm taken aback based on others' reactions because I'm kind of like, well, wait, like I thought we were supposed to talk this way. And then I'm feeling kind of like I have this vulnerability hangover. And to your point, I'm on the blacklist because or the unforgotten, communication list. So it's a real thing. And I still believe that there's a lot more work that needs to be done, because what you're speaking to, Steven, is having kind of that emotional whole person performance approach is kind of what we dub here at Intuitive Performance, whole person performance, meaning that it's not just our hearts and feelings are left at home, they come with us. We're a whole package. And so separating our work self from our personal self is no longer a thing. But then how do you help employers feel comfortable? Because from a societal perspective, it's been so uncomfortable to talk about feelings in the workplace, or to get deep in the workplace, or even personal in the workplace. So what's your thought process around normalizing these types of conversations with many different types of behaviors or attitudes that are out there?
Well, so to your point, it's a really important issue, and people have a lot of different takes on it. And you're not saying that as words exactly, but they just have, like, do we go emotional or what? But here's the bottom line: is it's all about the bottom line. So the reason why I'm able to do work with the military and all these organizations is because I'm not coming in from a touchy-feely aspect. I'm not saying it wouldn't, it's nice to have a kinder, gentler workplace. I believe that. But what I like to do is translate it to the bottom line. So let's be real specific. So if I'm a leader and I'm not getting that unsaid said, I have to make all the right decisions, but I can also make a drastically wrong decision because nobody's going to challenge me about that. Right. And also, people don't cross-challenge each other, too, and which we can discuss. And so I come at it from what is the most effective in the workplace. So when somebody says, well, whether it's the right thing to do or the emotional, we care, I agree with all of those are important considerations. Yeah. But you can have the same argument and make the business case. It's important to create that emotional safety because it's great for good business.
Yes.
Besides great for great relationships.
Yeah. And I mean, to be clear, I'm not talking about white picket fences and having rosy glasses. What I'm talking about explicitly is that emotional intelligence piece, because we know that over 88% of successful leaders have high levels of emotional intelligence, which backs into what you're talking about with regards to that emotional safety place. So I really enjoy that. And getting a little bit more curious, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to get, because here's what I'm imagining a lot of people might immediately think. Well, I have somebody who doesn't make me feel safe. So what do I do? So let's give them a tactical thing, because I'm all about, okay, what do we do? So that's a good getting the unsaid said. Look, I want to talk to you about how we could improve the working situation or how we're collaborating, whatever. And I sometimes feel like I walk on eggshells. I'm not, and then it's a very important line to use. I'm not blaming you. It's just how I feel about this, and I'm worried about bringing this up.
Exactly.
Most people will say, no, go ahead. But if you say that and they go, well, what do you mean? You go, well, that's what I mean. I really have a hard time talking to you, right? So it's important to always, again, getting the unsaid said. I'll give you another example where people think, oh, that that could cause problems when really it's the solution. I was doing a session for FEMA, and this lady said, getting the unsaid said can cause problems. I said, well, give me an example. She said, well, there's a guy who I work with who drops the ball a lot, and he's causing problems with the rest of the team. And so I gave him the feedback, and he got upset. And I said, well, why did you say that? She said, why? I said that because I care about what we're up to. I care about him. I also want us to achieve these results, and I care about the team. But I want this to all work well together, us all to work well together. And I said, did you say all of that? And she said, I didn't. I said, I want to come back to my premise. The biggest problem is not what we say, it's what we leave out. You have to say the total package.
Right.
So it's very important what you're bringing up, because it's really the critical element to moving things forward. So I know I interrupted, but I wanted to give somebody, well, what can I do? That's what we can do, is still get the unsaid said.
Oh, and I love that, because I strongly believe that it's all about knowledge to action, right? So, okay, it's great. I understand your concept. It's all about saying the unsaid, but then how do I do it? And how do you move people from a place of discomfort to comfort? Because that's a learned behavior for sure.
Well, first of all, is to reframe comfort. When we're uncomfortable, that's a sign of growth. It's not a sign to stop. Now, there are certain exceptions to that, but overall, somebody will say, well, I'm just not comfortable with that. And I'm like, okay, so what's your point? We throw out these things, but actually when we grow in life, I can think of many teachers and mentors of mine, where I've learned so much, where they push me to do something. Sometimes I'm like, I don't even agree, but I did it and I'm so thankful, right? Because, or how about this, just on a daily basis, or when we have to have that difficult conversation and honest conversation, getting the answers that it is uncomfortable.
Yes.
But that's exactly the sign to go. So it's reframing that and then giving some people specific tools. An example of a specific tool is to be fact-based and then make sure we have a suggestion. Because if you ever had somebody just come to you and say, well, I just start, and they start sharing and you're like, okay, so what do you want, right? Where are we going with this? You know, and say, well, I just want you to know. And I'm like, okay, is there something underneath that? Right. So a really good question to ask people is to say, so what would you suggest? Or where would you like to go with that? Well, there's a lot there about what we're talking about.
I agree 100%. And I think too, the onus is often on leaders, not just the employee to feel comfortable, but leaders to set that stage of what you call emotional safety. Because I'll give you an example. We had one client and they had these types of conversations. Part of their internal core values was all about transparency and honesty, and they defined it. And they also gave examples as to what that looks like. And they're talking about it in their meetings, and they have the rubber sessions, and it's really great, but not one person did it. And it wasn't until we started having conversations about, okay, well, what does this explicitly or implicitly mean to us to have these types of kind of transparent conversations? Well, some of those conversations, to your point, was feedback upwards or feedback sidewards or feedback downwards. And not one person was comfortable. They called it challenging conversations. And so to your point, it's asking the hard questions again in that moment for them. Okay, well, what makes it challenging? And what are we losing if we don't ask these questions or have these conversations? And so one leader that they garnered a lot of respect from me out of the gate, because they looked across the table at their team member and they said, this is going to sound really wonky or uncomfortable because I am uncomfortable. And I was like, that's it right there. That's it right there. Because as a leader, when you show the action of vulnerability, when you show the action of willing to communicate, it's so, so important for your team, because oftentimes, whether it's positional power or influencing power as a leader, you do have that power. And using it for your team, I think, is so important. So setting that stage really is kind of the crux of it all, right?
Not only that, but I love where you're headed with that and those examples, because it just triggered some other thoughts where it's also about managing the whole team. So, for example, I was dropped into an organization where the leader created that openness, but they had a member of the team that their eyes would roll when they in disapproval of other conversations. You know, like, okay, yeah, great. And so what it did is it created that uneasiness, whether you would call it a fear or uneasiness or whatever, but it didn't invite people to share. How about this, when you have somebody on a team who's a know-it-all or very self-righteous? And you can always tell self-righteous people because they always tell you about how much they know. Like, even if you give them a piece of advice, oh yeah, I knew that. Yeah, I knew. But always, I know, right? And so, but if we don't manage those dynamics, it will shut down the rest of the team. And I've worked with a lot of leaders who will say, well, I can manage that person's personality. My comeback is, you can, but what about everybody else? What is it doing to the team? That's one thing. The other thing is, it's really important is when people share, it's really important to reward that honesty. Now, this sounds very simple, but what I'm not talking about is just saying thanks for sharing. You got to use that information. And so, you see this a lot with these organizations that do the employee surveys, right? They launch it, but then it takes months and months to give that the key leaders and people feedback, and then they don't take action. So pretty much people assume, well, why share it? I feel comfortable to share, but what's the point? It's useless. So it's important to get that unsaid said, and there's many strategies to doing that, which we could talk about, and then to reward that honesty, which is also equally important.
Definitely, and I think that it's really important point that you raised, Stephen, in the sense of the strategy, because every organization has a different vibe. They have a different culture set or background, etc., right, as to what is comfortable versus not comfortable in these arenas. And I've seen it in one organization, and again, it came from the top. They started doing it out of the demand of remote working, but they continued it because, to your point, it allowed people to hear more, or, the unsaid is said, right? So what they did was they started operational meetings. I think it was like an online stand-up meeting Monday mornings. And the CEO would start with identifying how they were showing up. So evidently one team member came in one day and they said, I'm showing up at half capacity, to be totally honest. Like, can you imagine one of your team members actually coming in 4 years ago saying, I'm coming in at half capacity? Like, people would be like, well, where's this going?
Yeah, exactly.
And so the story that she had to tell behind that was, I'm coming in at half capacity. My daughter has a dairy allergy and she was a toddler. And so I spent half the overnight kind of cleaning things up because she got into dairy and I didn't realize it until bedtime, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought that was absolutely beautiful and amazing, because then it allows people, to your point, having that emotional safety in the workplace to be like, so, hey, if my tone's off today, it's because I'm at half capacity. Or if I'm feeling a little impatient or rushed, it's because of that project deadline, nothing personal, right? So I think even having those micro instances of honoring emotional safety is really important in the workplace as well, instead of just focusing on, agenda items and maybe some high level pleasantries to kind of get into meetings, et cetera.
It's great. In fact, when that was done, I wonder if the question then was followed up with, how can we support you? What can we do? Is there working around? Because really, again, it really is critical to create that safety and then to move it along if that's what the person wants. It's just the support. So, but I love that example, because one of the things I like to do just to kick off a session is to say, do a go around, what's on your mind? And it could be, and I'll say, it can be related to work, it could be unrelated to work, whatever's on your mind. And it gives people that freedom to share. And so, I've got a sick child, or this is an issue, or I'm worried about this project and we're having a meeting now and my head is somewhere else. And I just like the check-in. So I think the more we allow people the freedom to speak, it's critical. It's like, if I had to create a slogan, it would just be free the people, And so, because even a lot of work I do around innovation, it's like people say, oh, certain people are more innovative than others. I don't believe that. I believe everybody's innovative if we just free them up from the limitations. So there's just a lot to be said about sharing.
Yeah.
I'm
interested because you had mentioned strategies earlier. Tell me more in the sense of what are different avenues to have those strategies set in place around saying the unsaid?
Great question. So there's 12 essential elements of a consistently high achieving team. One of them is everyone shares to get the unsaid said. And the key is everyone. So the way to do that is to ask, there are many strategies, but two that come immediate to mind out of this conversation. And I'll share with folks. First, ask everyone a question. So, if people are in a meeting and they're not saying much, why are they in the meeting? We need everybody's wisdom. And if we say things like this, does anybody have any questions? Or who wants to share? It invites only the people who tend to be more gregarious to share, but it also makes us susceptible to a really bad scenario, which is we make a decision based on the loudest voice. So the way to counteract that is you ask everybody a question. Now, we're not going to be able to do it at every time on every issue, but I'll do go rounds with the team, and it's not an option to not share. And so we counteract that by just asking everybody to share. The other thing that's critical is asking direct questions, that are open-ended questions, but direct questions, instead of saying, so do you agree? Okay, yeah, I agree. But if I say, how is this landing with you? If I'm a leader and I'm saying, so I want to get some feedback on this issue. We're working on this project and we think we're in the right direction. How's this landing with you? Well, that takes somebody, they have to process this. They can't just say it's landing. They would say it's landing, and or how is it? What are you seeing out of this conversation? All of those create the mind to process and to share more, and then you can really find out where people are at and get great suggestions potentially too.
Definitely. And in your experience, Steven, has there been any resistance to those types of strategies? Like you had said something that sparked interest in me, where it was like, there's no choice. Everybody shares. So what about those people that are, a little bit more closed off, or they tend to be a bit more nervous, or maybe they're more of an introvert? how do you approach it in those scenarios?
I just get right into it. So here's what I found is if you call on people who are not used to sharing, they may get upset, but they will not get upset if we create that emotional safety and we reward the honesty. So you're right. If somebody's used to hiding out or not sharing, and I suddenly said, so please share what they might feel uncomfortable. And again, it could be a sign of growth, but they might feel nervous and comfortable or whatever, or annoyed even. But if when they share, we reward it with, creating that safety, and then we do something with it. For example, might say, wow, that was a really great point. It gets me thinking about this, or what if we did this, or let me ask you a follow-up question, somehow rewarding that honesty. To date, and I've been at this for 25 years, when creating that emotional safety and rewarding honesty, I've never had anybody be upset. Never.
Love it.
They might have initially inside, but as long with those lines, having those two steps, which sounds simple, but a lot of times it isn't. For example, this is my favorite. I got to add this in. Have you ever had somebody say, listen, you can tell me anything. I love honest feedback. And then you tell them something, they flip out, and they get mad. Then what's remarkable is later on, they don't really realize it. And they'll go, well, so do you have any more feedback on this? And you're like, no. People are saying this to lie to them. They're like, I'm not going there. Anyway,
exactly.
Emotional safety, rewarding honesty.
Yeah, I really enjoy that. And to your point, I tend to agree. It's not something that's often intentionally thought about. I think that's what you're getting at, right? As to how do I intentionally reward the honesty? How do I intentionally ensure that people feel safe to have those continuous shares? Because it is quite important for the bottom line. We have some huge challenges with regards to engagement, as we know, worldwide. Like if I read an article, I think a few weeks ago, and if I recall correctly, I think it was a $7.8 trillion problem, employee engagement in the workplace.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
And we know that communication is a huge facet of that. So you're definitely onto something. I should have probably asked this earlier, but can you share with us, Steven, your kind of life lessons around this that has driven you to kind of this point?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I've taken a lot of, well, I'll just get right into it. So when I was growing up, first of all, I didn't start speaking really till at 3.5. My parents realized there was a problem. So they took me to a doctor. My ears were blocked or whatever. And so kind of cutting to the chase, I then went to Easter Seals and learned how to speak, because then, I had to play catch up and whatnot.
Yes.
But I was always very socially awkward, and this stuff never came naturally. Some people say, oh, I bet you've always been positive. I'm like, no, not really. And I bet you always get along with people. No, not really. And so I was really socially awkward, nerdy, and bullied a lot. And then when I got to college, there was a pivotal time when I could share. But basically, what struck me was I said to myself at a certain point, why do other people get along with people and I don't? And I started to realize there were things that I was doing, and then I learned there's certain traits of successful people versus not. And I just by accident started to look at this, which comes naturally to me to dissect problems, but I never really realized it with human relationship problems. Anyway, so once I figured that out, then things dramatically turned around for me. And so that experience taught me something that was pivotal in my life, is that all of these skill sets, which are leadership, emotional awareness, even emotional intelligence, working with people, all of that can be learned. There's specific things that people can do that can transform their life. So when somebody says, well, it's just not natural for me, or I've never been good at that, it's an excuse. You can turn around that. I remember even about 6 months ago, there's a friend of mine there's a bunch of people I know who run businesses, but my one friend said, do you believe that all people can sell? And I said, absolutely. He said, well, I don't believe that. And I said, well, it's been my experience that if they know certain things, they can sell. Now, some may be better than others, but all can be really good at stuff. So being a great leader is learned. Some people have learned it by accident, but most people, there are things that they can learn. Honest communication, all that stuff. So you can tell I get really jazzed about this, because I don't like it when people stop themselves short and they think it's like, leadership is a natural born, or charismatic, even charisma. All of that can be learned.
Very much so. And what was coming up for me was has nothing to do with this topic and everything to do with it at the same time. There was this individual, same sort of scenario, feeling it like a bit like they're not fitting in, trying to find themselves. And they started researching comedy, and they noticed, yeah, they noticed patterns. And so they become almost like a world renowned speaker. And I can't think of his name at the top of my head, but if you were to watch his YouTube videos, you would have thought he was hilarious. And it was just something that was organic, and it always had just happened and clicked for him. But it was something that he actually studied and learned, the formula of making people laugh. And so he was able to take that to different stages. And so to your point, communication, emotional intelligence, leadership, I agree with you 100%. It's a learned behavior. It's not innate. It's not, you're not stuck unless you want to be. And that's where it comes into, I feel, a lot of mindsets stuff that needs to change to help people elevate and continue their growth, for sure.
Yeah, and so a couple of things right off the bat, as we're talking about this, I want to remind folks. If I wrote a book years ago around, basically it's around this 9-step formula to have an honest communication and resolve issues with anyone. If anybody wants that, if they mention your show and they send us an email, we'll send them that booklet.
Amazing.
Yeah, so I want them to have it. So it's not like, oh, he's dangling something. No, I'm going to send it to you for free. And the other thing is, if they look at most problems, it is all formulas. Like we created a formula about how to turn any team into a consistently high achieving team. And so when you really look at problems, we can take an engineering approach to it, and we can solve stuff. So definitely I want people to walk away and say, okay, I want that 9-step formula. We're going through some of the things now, and they don't need all 9 steps, but I want them to have it, and it's not going to cost them anyone. All they have to do is mention your show and send us an email.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that offer, Steven. I'm sure our listeners would absolutely enjoy and jump into that. One thing that was coming up for me too, as you were speaking, when you're talking about patterns, is what's your thought process around helping people discover that it really has to often do with the human skills behind their bottom line? So, getting people behind that thought process that it's not the actual output, it's the input, i.e. humans.
So, well, first of all, the way I look at all problems is it breaks down to 4 areas. First, is the person mentally capable to do that? And usually the answer is yes. But then the next 3 things is, do they have the right mindset? Do they have the right skill set? And is there a sustainment? And so a lot of training and a lot of stuff comes around skill set, but if somebody doesn't have the right attitude, the perspective is not going to work. But also just the motivation, the attitude doesn't work unless they have the right skill set. So the way I like to break down problems and then show them that'll work. So let's go back to like that 9-step formula, but we can go through a couple key ones where if somebody's very clear on what the facts are around the issue, they make a request, and they share what's in it for the other person, those 3 steps, they can actually bring up most difficult, challenging conversations. So what I'll do in a session is, and I love to do this, I'll say, have a case, I want you to have a case study of the most difficult, challenging person you have in your life. And by the end, when I walk you through this formula, I'm going to walk you through exactly how to have that conversation. If you walk away and you can do it and you do it, that builds that confidence. So the way I show people to do this is I have them choose a case study, work them through it, and then when they're off and doing it, it's transformative. It really comes down to having them work on their own issues.
Yes, exactly. And if I recall correctly, when I was kind of doing some recon on you, Steven, on your website, there's something called this honesty calculator.
Oh yeah.
Does that tie into what you were just saying?
Yeah, in fact, I always forget about all the stuff that's on there. So again, this doesn't cost anything. So if you go to our website, justbehonest.com, and at least where it is right now, but it's we might move it. Anyway, honesty calculator. And what happens is it asks you through a series of questions, but after the series of questions, it converts that soft kind of conversation and translates it into exact costs of money and time in your life and other potential costs. And it's transformative because what people realize is what they're putting off, it's not just an annoyance, it's really impacting their life in ways they never realized. So I like to work, I take executives and also leaders through that, because it shows them that this soft issue, this team issue, is actually costing them millions of dollars and many, many hours of which they could be doing other things. So it sounds obvious, but it works through. So anyway, then go through it, and it's really neat on the output.
Awesome. Awesome. I love that. And it rings a bell for me too. I think there was, not I think, Dr. Cy Wakeman, they did a study actually when it comes to, they call it emotional waste. So how much time do we spend at work talking about other people, what they've done in our own headspace, you know? So, you know, maybe Steven gives Angela an assignment, Angela does the assignment, then Steven gives Angela feedback that she doesn't like. And then so Ange is talking to all of her peers at work, like, can you believe Steven said this about me, and he said that about my work, and he did this? On average, their study came out at, I think it was 2 to 3 hours per person, minimally per week or per day. And it was substantial in the sense of, from an evidence-based perspective, if we have those conversations and say things like, hey, Steven, that kind of hit me in a hard place. Is there any way that you can reframe that feedback so that I can really understand it from an objective perspective, right? So if Angela was able to really say that to Steven and not feel intimidated or like it was a challenging conversation, et cetera, imagine how much, not just time from a productivity perspective, but even the mindset perspective that slows you down as well, right?
Yeah, and it impacts quality of life. Size, she's really great. I saw her this past summer. Anyway, I completely agree. And then there's that emotional stress. We lose sleep. There was a lot of things that people just don't realize the ramifications. So kind of the way I developed that honesty calculator is I was teaching it with people, which I'll say, you know, choose an issue, but walk them through. And to your point, when they started calculating the hours, all involved in this, they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I put up with this. But it's really not about the other person. It's about what we've put up with in our life. Just think about how many hours we've wasted on this planet having stupid conversations that didn't go anywhere, talking to other people that couldn't do anything about the issue because it's not direct to that person. Or how about this? People who complain to us about other people, and you're like, I'm not the person, go talk to them.
Lots of unlearning, lots of opportunities for unlearning, right? I understand you. And I think we've all been there at some point in our lives, right? Being totally vulnerable. I know that I have in past. I've been that crappy employee that has wasted time because I was stressed about something, but didn't have the gusto to say it right away. But having known what I know now, you know, I would have handled those situations totally different and stood up for myself, or in some circumstances just advocated to have further clarity and understanding so that it wasn't an issue, right?
Absolutely. I can think of, you know, when we really look at our life, we've grown in life by our failures and learning from them, more than just taking our successes that might have happened by accident or whatever and kind of building them there. It's really the failures. It just struck me, like years ago, I did this, I do a lot of TV interviews, but I did this interview and I got back to the office and I said to my assistant, I thought I did a great job. But I said to my assistant, how'd I do? And she said to me, Christina said to me, do you really want to know? And I'm like, yeah. It was pretty horrible. And then she proceeded to say, I repeated myself. I was doing all these other things and I was crushed. And, you know, now I thought, oh my God, this is such an embarrassment. But then, you know, after I got over feeling sorry for myself, I realized those were all things I could learn and grow from. And it helped me immensely. I mean, I could tell you many times where like somebody gives you feedback and you're like, it's really hard hitting, but they'll say that and you're like, you know, especially the ones when you react, we know there's probably an element of truth, if not completely true. You know, and you just think about things in life. I mean, I remember, I mean, I can go on and on and on. Anyway, the point is, to your point, it's like, you really hear this. And then the moment of truth is, how are we going to react? Because if I said to Christina in that case, you know, what do you mean that I was doing great and get defensive? She would have never given me feedback again. Who would, right? And so it's really challenging to, when we think about feedback, is not when they're saying the good stuff, it's really when they're saying the tough part. In fact, what I often say to people, the people you trust the most are the ones that say the difficult things. Everybody can say the good stuff, but they're really the ones. How often are people pushing you? I'll say to executives and leaders, how often are you having debates in a meeting? If you're not having debates, that somebody's not being upfront. It's healthy. You want to have that disagreement, but we have to be able to take it.
Yes, exactly. 100%. And I love where you're going with this, because my business partner and I, like, we kind of dub ourselves yin and yang now. We've been together in business for 3 years. He's in Ontario, I'm in Nova Scotia. And, in the first year and a half, we really bumped heads about strategic decisions, goal setting. I'm the kind of visionary, pie in the sky, like, let's go get everything. And he's like, hold on, like, let's make some calculated risks, and we got to take these steps. And I'm like, fuck the steps. We need to just get stuff done. Right. So I would get super passionate about things, but we've learned to not just accommodate each other, but see each other in the sense of what we need. And so now we speak to each other in the sense of, okay, what's our 75%? It doesn't have to be perfect, but what does that look like? And conversely, and can you get a little bit more curious about this so that we can dive a little bit deeper, and understanding that we're coming at this together. So, we make jokes now, like Brene Brown did a beautiful job in talking about the arena and how to show up. Right. And so, I make jokes now where it's like, are you ready to rumble? And so setting that stage in a comic relief manner, but we both know that we're serious. Yeah, we're getting into a place, or we're moving into that place of giving each other constructive feedback, whether it be on a program that we're developing, or a client meeting that we had, or with our own consultants, etc. So I think, again, it comes back to, how are you setting that stage for emotional safety so that everybody sees that their value and heard, and that their part really matters with regards to any conversation that you're having.
There's another element too that just struck me as you're talking, which I think is really critical. And that is the whole vulnerability angle, right? So another way to get the unsaid said with people is when we're vulnerable.
Yes.
If somebody's just asking a lot of questions, they may open up, but as leaders, are we sharing our vulnerability? So I often coach leaders, it's not just about you mentoring others, but share how you messed up and what you learned from that. Because people look to you and they'll say, well, that person always had that, is perfect. But they've always had that. And they don't realize all the trials and tribulations that bring us to where we're at. And then some people have a hard time showing that vulnerability. But as we all know, vulnerability is a sign of strength. It's not a sign of weakness. In fact, when people are not vulnerable, that they're weak. Because if you think about it, somebody who doesn't share, it's because they're afraid of something.
Right.
Afraid of, if you know who I really am, you're not going to like me, or you're not going to work with me. But if I have the courage to share, it also connects and things. There's a part in the work I do around with teamwork is I develop these questions that is essentially you get to know each other on a much deeper level. And, it depends on how deep somebody wants to go. But after that, the connection and the walls come down, and we're able to solve all kinds of things. But a lot of it has to do with that vulnerability, and vulnerability will create that openness.
100%. Yeah. And I think I was hearing another thing in there too. It's not just about vulnerability. It's what type of effort as a leader are we putting forward for connectivity, right? Because that's the output of vulnerability, is that you're able to connect with someone. And that's what we crave as humans. And then that feeds into your return on investment, right? So taking it from the soft skills, which I call core skills from a human perspective, and bringing it all the way over to kind of your financial return on investment. When people feel connected to you and tied to you, that's 2xing their performance out of the gates, right? Yeah.
A connection is so critical, and its connection is really important even in negotiation. People often, when you really look at a lot of problems and solving stuff, it's all hung up on the issues, but it really is about how people operate with each other in that connection. For example, when we really like someone and we respect them, we give them much more latitude. When we don't like somebody or we don't respect them, then we're extremely critical and we don't give them any latitude. So leaders who build that connection, and one of the ways to do that, as we've all seen, is by listening. So we've all met leaders who just talk at people, but the best CEOs, admirals, and generals I've ever worked with, they spend way, way, way more time listening than they do talking. they'll say, oh, that's interesting. Tell me more. Or even where'd you grow up, or just getting to know you. But no matter what, they spend more time listening than talking.
Definitely. And it's organically kind of taking that coach approach on, right? And so when it comes to listening, what they're really delving into is a more intimate level of listening. So they're hearing not what that person's saying, but also what they're not saying. The different tone changes. Is that person leaning into me or away from me? Like you're able to interact with someone if you do take that time to listen. And I think it's so important because, there's often times where I've seen leaders and they have their cell phone out on the desk and they keep hitting the button, right? They keep hitting the button. What time is it? What time is it? And we're sitting in a meeting and the meeting's not going to end for like another 40 minutes, right? Or they're checking emails, or they're literally responding in the middle of a meeting to something that's going on, albeit it might be important, but we're not saving lives, right? In most industries, I guess we'll say. So having the ability to pause and listen as a leader, I think is really another kind of caveat to emotional safety, because I know for myself, I can't speak for anybody else, but I know myself, if I'm sitting here talking to you, Steven, and you're looking at your email and, basically you're telling me you're bored, you're not interested in this conversation. And so if I have something serious to say to you, I'm going to pause, or I might even be as bold in some circumstances to be like, is this a good time to have a deeper conversation? Because I'm not sure if you're checked in or checked out.
And you bring up something else, is even managing group dynamics and meetings. So, for example, I've seen leaders, they don't handle this well. I'll give you a specific example. I was doing a session for a client and I was going to do a speech. So just a portion. So I was sitting back watching the meeting, and then I was going to be coming up, and it was a small, intimate kind of, it was their leadership meeting, the senior leadership team. And there was this one leader who was looking at his phone and actually even text. So and then before I went on, and then when I went on, I said, hey, can anybody put away the phones? I said to my client later, I said, do you notice he does that? He goes, yeah, it really bothers me. I said, why do you allow that? He goes, well, it may be important issues. I'm like, yeah, but you're not, but allowing that to occur is sending a message that he doesn't respect you and he doesn't respect other people. Even if he does, it's sending that message. So I encouraged him you've got to pull that person aside and let him know about these dynamics, and we have to be responsible about that. So I've seen leaders who don't make these tough calls, put the phone away, or let's get the meeting done. And they allow people to have all kinds of distractions. And then they wonder why people don't share stuff. And the reason why is because it was like other people thinking, what's the point? Who cares?
Exactly. How would you mentor someone to set that type of tone or environment? Because you said, making the tough calls around putting away phones or putting away work while you're in those certain meetings. So let's just say you have a leader and they are, more of an avoider when it comes to kind of having those curt conversations. How can you set them up for success so that they can approach it in their way without feeling, like they're acting like a fraud or chameleon by being rough and gruff?
So I like to tie it to show them the consequences. So I'll give you a specific example. I was working with a CEO and she was really fantastic, but there was somebody on her team who was not really doing a great job. Everybody else was, but they kind of knew it. And so she allowed this person to go on because the person had some history with the company in a good way. I mean, they'd worked for many years, but clearly they weren't performing, and she knew it, and it was that issue, right? But she wasn't getting the unsaid said, and she wasn't getting a resolve. So she said, yeah, I know I need to do it, but she was really feeling uncomfortable about it, right? And then how will the other teams, receive it? And so what I did is I reframed it. I said, if you don't want to do it for yourself, which, okay, because you say I can handle it, do it for the rest of the team. Because do you realize how it's impacting other people? So, for example, when we have somebody on our team who's working, let's say, at 50%, and this is a big issue right now because where people are hurting to fill certain slots, and with leaders, I mean, it's hard to sometimes recruit people. So, in fact, I just had this issue a week or two ago where somebody said, well, I have a member of the team who's not performing. And so, but if I lean too hard, then, they're going to go. And I said, I know what you're talking about, because you're thinking, well, if they're working at 50%, if I no longer working there, it'll bring it down to zero, and then I'm going to have even worse problems. But I said to them a week or two ago, as I said to the CEO, I said, you want to do it on behalf of everybody else because you'll demotivate everybody else. And so what will happen is if you allow that to stick, then other people are going to bring down their performance. It doesn't inspire great performers. So we want to have these conversations because we owe it to other people. And so what I'll do is, for people who have a hard time, I'll walk them through, let's look at the consequences, honestly, right? And I don't try to push them, say, let's look, what is it costing you? Maybe it's not worth having the conversation. Like, oh, no, it is. I'll say, well, why? And we'll look at that. And then by looking at that and translating into specific consequences, that usually inspires them to take action because they realize they really need to.
I think that's amazing in the sense of having candid conversations with leaders, but meeting them where they're at and asking questions as to, okay, what are you going to win or lose? I think is what I'm hearing if you choose to use a conversation or not. And ultimately, I think what I'm hearing is it helps them lean into their beliefs. Tying back to earlier in the conversation, Steven, where you're pointing out gratefully that it doesn't need to be a challenging conversation. It just needs to be a safe conversation, and ensuring that, you know, you're getting to the bottom line around what you're trying to express from a communication perspective.
Well, and some of the conversations that I work with people on the level is extremely touchy. So an example would be, I was working with this other leader, and on purpose I leave out details because of confidentiality, obviously.
Understood, of course.
But she had a member of her team who not only wasn't doing a great job, complained to other people, but often threatened that if anybody ever tried to do something like hold her accountable, or she didn't say exactly hold her accountable, she would, launch back. And so my client was very, very afraid because she looked at all the ramifications of what would probably happen. So I said to her, you cannot manage in fear, and you owe it to the whole team to do something about it. And so I said, if you're afraid of certain consequences, get that figured out before you have the conversation. Admittedly, I wouldn't go into it blind, but don't not have the conversation. So I worked with her on getting all her ducks in a row. She had the conversation. The person immediately threatened the whole situation, this is wrongful suit and all that stuff, but she had done all the work. And so when it moved, so the person threatened, and then when she realized that my client wasn't afraid, the whole issue, and the person just left the company, and it all worked out. And you know what? People came up to her, because there's two things I've always seen whenever you make a personnel move. Whenever there's a personnel move, moving the person to another position or whatever, but whenever the case is, two things always happen. First, the person always says, I can't believe I waited this long, once the person is moved. And then they always say the second thing, it's worse than I thought. Because when you make that move, it's like lifting up a rock and you see all the other issues you didn't see. And that's sure enough what happened with my client. So, and I said to her, when you finally make this move and want to do the right thing and all the right appropriate guidelines and whatnot, is you're going to see that it's worse than you ever thought. It always happens. So we always wait too long, and it's always worse than what we're thinking. So whenever we're thinking about a personnel move, it's not that we got to get rid of the person. We just have to have that tough conversation for whatever it is, not only for ourselves, but for the organization and definitely for the team.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for your insights today, Steven. Everyone, Steven Gaffney, CEO of Steven Gaffney Company. On one last note, Steven, how can people reach out to you?
Great. Thank you for asking. So Just Be Honest, if they go to our website, justbehonest.com. And again, if they say that they've listened to the show, they send us an email, we'll send them that book all about having difficult conversations, that 9-step formula. So all they got to do is go to our website, justbehonest.com. And of course, if they want any help with their company, they can always ask us, and we'll help out too.
Fantastic. Thank you again for your time, Steven. And if anybody's looking for further information from the Human Side of Business podcast, feel free to reach out to us at intuitiveperformance.com. Take care.